Good morning. Today is April 6th, 2025, and welcome to the TSS weekly lectures. The TSS is the Toronto Spiritist Society. We're a Spiritist center based in Toronto, Canada, and I welcome all of those who are joining us this morning for the lecture, or maybe looking at the lecture at a later time at your leisure, either through Facebook or to YouTube. Welcome. Typically, we would have these lectures in person at our Spiritist Center, but we're moving. We're going to a new location. So for the next few weeks, we will be working exclusively online, virtually, but hopefully very soon, within sometime in May, we'll restart our activities, and we would hope you would join us at that time. Today's lecture is going to be a bit of a religious or biblical refresh around the patriarchs and what were their missions and why they have been, they were chosen, and the whole story of that is told in the Bible. But before we start, I'd like to have just a quick prayer, as we usually do, to start our proceedings. And hopefully you will join us by closing your eyes and raising our thoughts to God, our Creator, thanking Him for us being here, for us being alive, and joining us in health or in kind of struggles through our lives. Welcome. And with that in mind, let us start, first of all, to go back to the very beginning. And I'll do this assuming that not everyone that will be listening to this lecture is fully conscious or fully aware of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, which is the most relevant to our lecture here today. So I'll do a recap very quickly, very simply, to tell us what is going to be the foundation for the beginning of the patriarchs, why they came, why was they important, and why do they existed. Now, the story that we see in the Old Testament, especially the very first chapters called the Genesis, is what's described as an origin story, because it tells the story of how we became, how we exist, and what has led us to this point. This is told from a perspective of the three major religions, or largest religions, which would be the Judaic, the Christian, and Islamic, all have the same origin stories coming from the Old Testament. But this is not the only one. Every civilization, or at least the ones that we know most, have their own origin stories. Whether these are the Native Americans, the natives in Brazil, the tribes in Africa, Indonesia. As we start to understand them and listen to them, they will all tell you some story of how they came into existence. Almost all of them will bring this story back to the moment when some kind of godlike entity created universe, earth, and all the people in it. So it's always interesting that we humans like to connect somehow to our beginnings, how we started, our journey, and with that, bring us today to try to reconnect with that source of divine power. So the Bible is probably one of the oldest recorded versions of an origin story. And as most of you will know, it begins with God creating one human, Adam. And he lived in paradise, in Eden. And later on, God created a partner, a companion for Adam, which was called Eve. Adam and Eve lived for a long time in Eden, enjoying the purity, the beauty, the perfection that God created in that garden. But through a series of temptations, Adam ends up biting the forbidden fruit, and Adam and Eve are expelled. Now, by that time, God had already created the universe, as explained right in the first versicles of Genesis. God created the universe in 6 days, rested on the seventh day. And so the universe was already there, and Adam and Eve were living in this very small part of it called the Gardens of Eden. By contradicting or going against God's wishes, they were punished. They left that beautiful paradise, and he was sent to earth to continue their existence. And so begins the journey of humankind, according to the Bible. They became the first men and women, and from them, they started to have children and started to populate the earth. And that first round of population lasted about 1,500 years, according to the Bible. And at that time, humans used to live a very long time. And remember that while they were in the Garden of Eden, they were immortals. They were not going to die. Once expelled, they were sent to earth. And here, they had a finite mortal life. But it was very long. Adam lived, according to the Bible, 900 plus years. And so many of their descendants continue to have these very, very, very long lives. And so it lasted for about 9 generations. And then something happened. God wasn't happy with what was happening with humans. He was not pleased with how humans were acting, how they were selfish, how they were not fulfilling his desires that he had for humankind. And he thought that he needed to make some changes. So 1,500 years after Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden, God prepares for this cleansing, this pressing the reset button. And that would happen through a deluge, a great flood that would flood the entire planet, killing everything that was in it, except those who would be saved. And how would they be saved? Well, if it's a flood, they would have to be saved in a boat. This was called Noah's Ark. So Noah was given a message from God saying that this huge flood was going to happen, and that he needed to be the savior of all the species that were to be continued in the world after the floods reside. So he goes about building this huge ark and saves at least 2 of each animal and his family, him, his wife, 3 sons and daughter-in-laws. They were put in the ark. They survive for 40 days into the flood. And when the flood is over, right, they come out and the world is empty except for them who were saved. So with this reset button, just like when Adam and Eve were expelled from Eden and started to populate the earth, this was take 2, right? It was humanity 2.0 starting. And now instead of just having one pair, one couple, now we had a few more. We have Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and daughters-in-laws. And from there, they will start to populate the earth again. At that time, they still had fairly long lives. But ultimately, God had seen that men, if they lived for very long, they were going to be tempted and be distancing themselves from God. So he's decided that was a mistake to make them have such a very long lives of hundreds of years. So he decides that we're going to have a maximum span of 120 years. But he doesn't do this immediately. Noah himself would live like his parents for over 900 years. But successively, every generation was becoming having shorter and shorter lives, up to where we are today, where most of us will live in the 80 to 100, a few would live over 100, and so forth. So here we are. We started all over again. The world is clean. God is trying to fix some of the problems he faced with humans during the first phase of humanity. And then obviously Noah and his wife become the parents of everyone on earth. And his family will start to repopulate this planet. And it goes like this for a few more years. In fact, it goes for quite a few years, for another 900 years or so, through 9 generations. And at that point, God feels it's time to start creating the notion of a covenant with his human creations. A covenant, as defined, is a contract, is an agreement, especially as how it's described in the Bible. The covenant that we're talking about is an explicit agreement between God and his people. What will God provide them, but also what they will have to do in return to God to deserve of those benefits, those promises that God is making. So at one point, he decides that Abraham would be the first to do so. Actually, Abraham was originally called Abram. He was a descendant of, obviously, of Noah and all the way back to Adam. And he becomes what's known as the first patriarch of the Bible. Patriarch is like a father figure, means that the founder of a family or a group of a tribe or so forth. So this is the first time that God has formally discussed with one of the humans this notion of a kind of a tribe or an ethnic group that will follow a lot of the God's desires. And Abram then becomes Abraham, and he is now the father of what we know as the 3 main religions: Christian, Jewish, and Islam. And this will happen through the various generations, children, grandchildren, so forth, that will come out of Abram's family tree. Now, this is happening according to the calculations of so forth, where we are today, and how many years it goes back, around 2,000 years before Christ is born. We will talk later about how this aligns with these scientific discoveries or determinations around the age of civilization, groups of people, and so forth, and see how this kind of sometimes aligns and sometimes doesn't align. But the key important thing is that the mission for Abraham was to be this first patriarch. He receives the covenant. God has made him promises and asks some things in return. He will begin to build his family and the nation, the notion of a nation or a group of people that have a common purpose. But he will be tested. He will be tested many, many times. And the Bible goes through a series of challenges that the patriarchs will be subject to. You may think that given what happened with the first time, when God started to populate Earth through the descendants of Adam and Eve, that he wanted to make sure that this second time, it was clear to humans what was expected, what should they behave, and what they should sacrifice. And there are many, many challenges, right? So the first challenge is that Abraham is married. He's married to Sarah. And When he's 75, and remember that Abraham is still going to have a very long life, he asks Abraham to leave where he was living in Ur and go to a new land that's been promised to Abraham to be the land of this great nation that will come with him. But throughout his life, Abraham has many moments of where he struggled with doubt, deception, and this is part of a common thread within the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. They leave to Canaan, and God continues to affirm that they will have this land for them forever, will be their land, which is where we see today, where Israel and the Palestine world is. One of the things that a lot of the patriarchs face was a difficult in getting children. The women were not particularly easy to impregnate. And in fact, it took Abram until he was 100 years old, and Sarah was 90, for her to be pregnant. And they finally gave birth to a son called Isaac. And given how difficult it was to impregnate, to get this child, you can imagine how much, obviously, Abraham and Sarah loved Isaac. And then, for reasons unknown to Abraham, and maybe given his doubts or his wavering in his faith to God, God demands that he sacrifice his only son. And difficult decision ahead. Abraham is ready to do that. He goes and prepares himself to sacrifice Isaac. And at the last moment, God provides a ram. It says, "Thank you. I just wanted to test you. Don't kill your son, Isaac. He's going to be your successor. So kill this ram inside." And this was proof that God was looking in terms of Abraham's unshakable faith, which is what God will look for in many of the stories in the Old Testament. Sarah actually dies before Abraham. She dies at 127 years old. Isaac gets married, and Abraham lives into the ripe age of 175. So you may think, well, that's a long life. But remember that his ancestors would live to 900, 700 years old. So 175, he was very young according to their standards, but still very old according to what we have today. So now they have Isaac. Isaac is the second patriarch. And Isaac was more of a kind of a middle man here. The covenant was established through Abraham, and Isaac was there to basically to do the continuity in terms of this covenant. He's to continue to show his faith to God. He also has a hard time in getting a child, a son. But still, he is known to be the man who starts to establish this notion of the nation in terms of continue to grow the family and making sure that the covenant is understood by everything else. Let me just check my notes here. Isaac is is also on the move. He needs to leave because of famine, right? He leaves, he moves to Gerar, which is in the Philistine land. And he actually becomes very rich, right? He becomes wealthy. He has two twin sons, Esau and Jacob, and those are problematic. They are twins, but they're very combative, very competitive between themselves. Especially Jacob was was a bit of a wild one. He deceives his brother in a couple of situations, deceives his parents. But at the end, Isaac forgives Jacob for his wrongdoings. And Esau becomes disgruntled, and he leaves to create what would be eventually different tribes who will be opposing to what will become Israel. And the wild one, Jacob, becomes really the continuation. He will become the third patriarch. What it's interesting to see as we go from Abraham to Isaac is that these are imperfect families. They are faced with some of the many challenges that we have in our own families. There is jealousy, there is deception, there's betrayal, there is unfaithfulness as well. So these are far from the perfect image of what we would see or expect from our current morals. But people looking back says, well, this had to be this way because God did not create them with this perfection. He created them to learn, to come to understand that the covenant that they were being given, the promises that God were to do, would subject them to these challenges, and they would have to overcome them. They would have to somehow come to an agreement. And all of these stories from these patriarchs, obviously they survive. The family survives. The covenant survives. And all of these stories are lessons that are recorded in the Old Testament that can be applied as moral bearings for those who followed. They were not to be seen as examples to be done, but actually examples of what happens when these things take place, when you allow these feelings, these sentiments to take over you and put at risk all of the things that could follow, all of the family relationships that you're putting at risk. And thus we come to, and actually Isaac was also seen as the quiet patriarch between Abraham and then Jacob. He was basically a model of submission, of someone who was trying to do the right thing, especially with his two sons, and creating a first level of stability, right? If Abraham was the first one and he challenged and he took forever to have a child, and then God almost makes him kills that child. So you can see that there was a lot of struggles with the first patriarch. The second one, Isaac, was more of trying to bring in the notion that everything's going to be okay, that you have to have some level of submission to God's wills. And this will bring you the continuity that you're looking for. And then you have Jacob, which was later named to be Israel, right? And he is the one that's seen as the father of the Jewish people. He was to come from what he was a deceiver in his early ages to the Israel, he was renamed Israel, which means one who wrestles with God, because he was challenging God as well. But ultimately, he is the father of 12 tribes with 3 different women. And these 12 tribes then are the tribes who eventually lead to the creation of the state of the nation of Israel. And his sons all have different parts. They also all had their own tribes. And they all went different ways, right? Leading them to really start to populate the region there in the Middle East, making sure that they would become the 12 tribes of Israel. Among them, there was one which was kind of his favorite, which was Joseph. And Joseph eventually goes to Egypt. Remember, the Egyptians were not too far. And his purpose, his mission was really to lead the way to eventually what would allow for the birth of Moses many years later. But Joseph, although was called the dreamer and the deliverer, he was also faced with famine, suffering. He experienced betrayal, suffering, exaltation, and then eventually forgiveness. Some would say that Joseph becomes a little bit of a model, what many centuries later will be the surgeons of Jesus Christ, who will face very similar challenges in his life. So these are the 3 or 4. I mean, some people think that the patriarchs are 3. Others would include Joseph as a patriarch as well, because he led to the salvation or the liberation of the Jews from Egypt. These were the 4 patriarchs in the Bible that has, certainly these are the ones that show direct link to the Jewish faith and thus Christianism. But there's also a branch that eventually will lead to the creation of Islam as well. So in many ways, we can say that they're not just historical figures in the Bible, but each one of them are also spiritual archetypes, as their stories challenge us in many different levels. One is to trust and have faith in God through all of the uncertainties that we live in our lives. To live faithfully in the mission that's been given to us. Each one of them had very difficult and unique missions, and they had to endure for many more years than we are typically alive now. And more importantly, as part of the covenant, as part of being patriarchs, is to ensure that these stories are continued to be told, that the stories of faith and of the purpose and responsibilities of the covenant continue to be passed from one generation to another. So this is a very quick summary. Apologies if I'm not the expert in terms of Bible here, but this is basically the essence of what the Old Testament tells us, of very difficult times, of a harsh God that's trying to teach through some kind calls a hard love, what that humankind would have to be. And through the patriarchs, this has ensured that the nation, obviously the nation of Israel and the others, continue and were able to survive and flourish all the way to today's date. But how does these stories align with Spiritism? This is the Toronto Spiritist Society. We are a Christian-based faith. But how does this align? Spiritism takes a more kind of connected view in terms of science. Now, the stories in the Bible, and even if we take these very long lifespans and so forth, only takes us a few thousand years back to when Adam would have first being expelled from Eden, only a couple of thousand years or 4,000 years ago, when the patriarchs would have been alive and proliferating. Even if you think in terms of this great flood destroying the entire earth and having to start over with just a few humans left, the math doesn't add up, right? We have scientific, archaeological proof of civilizations or remains of civilizations that far goes beyond this timeline of maybe 5,000-6,000 years before Christ, and spread all over the world. It would be difficult to imagine how a few people surviving the flood in the Middle East could propagate so quickly to all of the points of the earth, considering oceans, weather, the whole thing. So in Spiritism, we have looked at the stories that the Old Testament gives us as more of symbolism, and maybe creating a few more links to what could have been other sources of these stories. Remember, these stories were passed on from generation to generation orally for many, many centuries. And only a few thousand years ago did we start having the first written records of the Torah, of the Old Testament, and the Bible. Obviously, as we know, if we tell stories from one person to another, there's always changes that take place, little embellishments, little changes that over time can really separate truth from reality. So in Spiritism, we have other stories that tells in terms of the origin of the earth and humankind. For those who would like to study more, we won't go into all of the details today, but the first book, Genesis. So in especially the first part of Genesis, it goes through quite a bit of detail on the creation of the universe and how God created the physical universe, but as well created the spiritual universe. In Spiritism, we believe that these two worlds coexist, right? One that's invisible to us, because we don't see spirits, at least the vast majority of us don't see spirits. We don't interact with the spiritual world. Obviously, we don't see it, we can't touch it, but it's there. And these two worlds, or these two universes, coexist in the same place. So for many, many centuries, we had this idea, this notion through all of the various religions of what happens when we die, where do we go, spirit, soul, a lot of different names. And in all these cases, obviously, they accept that we don't see it, but we couldn't explain it. Is it possible scientifically that there could be two different universes overlapping each other? Well, science actually is becoming closer and closer to maybe providing some of the answers for that for us. Not too long ago, a few decades ago, we started to see mathematically that the universe does not behave the way it should behave if we only consider the things that we can see, things that through the normal forces that we're accustomed to interacting with, gravity, electromagnetism, and so forth, simply couldn't explain it. And we created, right, this concept of dark matter. Now, not because it's dark or anything, it's just because we can't see it. And later, we also accepted the notion that there will be dark energies interacting, or at least somehow impacting the gravity of this universe. So there is a little bit of interaction, but gravity is the weakest force that we know of in terms of our physics. So in theory, physics is postulating the idea that there could be this entire other universe sitting just around us with different particles, different energies, just like our universe has particles and energies. And from those particles and energies, we see everything that was created, the planets, the galaxies, life, right? All of this was created from particles and energies. And so we have other particles and other energies that are out there that we don't see, but it's becoming, we're getting closer and closer to understanding how they exist and what would they look like. So it's not too far-fetched for us to start thinking that maybe these are the building blocks of the spiritual world. Who knows? We'll probably not see this anytime soon. Excuse me. But it's interesting because it starts to put in the realm of possibilities and not just imagination, that there could be another universe, a dark universe sitting with us. But instead of calling it dark universe, we could call it the spiritual universe. So maybe what we call dark matter and dark energy, we could call it spiritual energy, spiritual matter. It's just terminology. And maybe one day maybe in the future, we will find out how this all works. Well, so Genesis, which again was written like Kardec, 19th century, not much later than Darwin's own explanation of the theories of evolution. And it's still very, very much relevant in terms of the story of how the universe, physical universe, was created. But we also need to understand now, why was the universe created and how was life created? Now, in terms of evolutionary theory, there's this belief or this sequence of events that shows how certain molecules were brought together under very extreme conditions to create amino acids, to create what eventually would be the most elementary forms of life, of organisms. And through billions of years of evolution has led us, right? To human beings, to animals, trees, everything that we see here on Earth. Which, it's a theory that has been evolution. There's a lot of reasons why we believe that path was taking place. On the other hand, if you take the Bible, you would see a scenario where everything was created as is by God. By God's will, he created the universe, life, plants, air, everything through those 6 days of work. And by the way, if you want to look at Genesis does explain how these 6 days could be aligned to some of the scientific geological eras that we have. I'll leave you to do that study on your own. It's quite interesting. But regardless, the stories, the origin stories from the Bible, was that it was all by intelligent design being God. Scientifically, today, evolutionary theory is the other extreme. It says there's no intelligence design. It was all by, some ways, random luck, by trial and error, by eliminating things that didn't work, and eventually we end up where we are today. Spiritists take a different view on this, and I'll show you. So I don't have the English version here. This is Evolution in Two Worlds. This is a book that was psychographed by Chico Xavier and Valdo Vieira. And it's a story from a spiritist point of view of how this evolution took place. And as you could imagine from where I've been discussing so far, it's neither one of the two theories or ideas that we have, evolutionary or creative, intelligent design. It describes that God created the universe and created spirits who became evolved and they learned how to do things over time. And among the things that they could do is they were like scientists. They could play around with biochemistry, and they started to experiment. God gave them a chore to create living beings that would be prepared to receive the spirits. And they needed to have a world where they could live in and they could survive. So these spirits, working as a group of scientists, started to experiment with a number of different scenarios, letting things evolve, fixing mistakes that they make that didn't work out, and eventually improving this in an intelligent way, not a purely random way, to the point that we are here today. So it's not like God created this perfection, but he created the spirits that were in charge to create this world. And in the spiritist view, we see that the size of this universe is so humongous. I mean, we're just such a small part that the same thing has happened in many other different planets. And they could have completely different physical characteristics. And the spirits that are incarnating there are being designed to live in a different environment. Even though the spirits are the same, their physical, biological body has to be adapted to the conditions of that planet. And it's very intriguing because it does allow us to imagine that the timelines of creating this beauty that we have, this wonderful world, would be difficult for us to accept. It was completely random. So to me, it makes a lot of sense that there was some intelligence, not a perfect intelligence, because the spirits are not God. So that's why a lot of the animals, a lot of the different creations eventually failed because they were not perfect, but they were learning from it. And as scientists, every round allowed them to improve a bit, which gives us who we are today. Now, in terms of human beings, right? So this kind of provides the origin stories for the physical universe, for life, for Earth, but it doesn't necessarily explain how some of the stories that we see in the Bible, if something similar happened, right? Because once these animals became ready for us and became the Homo sapiens species, they were ready to receive our spirits. And then spirits were coming to populate here. And they would start to learn their own lessons around creating society, survival, building those two wings that we always talk about spiritism, the intellectual and the moral wings for the improvements of the spirits, reincarnation. They actually had very short lives because the environment was harsh, which allowed them to reincarnate and start improving and learning in each life. But it doesn't necessarily explain the creation of the various leaps that sometimes we see. We go back thousands of years. Suddenly, in one part of the world, we have very basic tribes living as hunters-gatherers. In other parts of the world, around the same time, we have civilizations becoming a lot more organized, growing, creating cities, creating wonders like pyramids, like Stonehenge, like the pyramids in Mexico, the Maya pyramids, Machu Picchu. All of these incredible engineering projects that were, multiple thousands of year generations ahead of the other ones. How could this happen, right? Now, part of the explanation then you will find in this book here, On the Way to the Light, right? So here it tells or tries to explain a little bit of how this could happen. And for us to understand this better, especially those who may be new to Spiritism, is that imagine the universe is billions of years old. Earth is much younger than the universe. But imagine in the spans of this universe how there could be so many other millions or even billions of planets that had similar stories, where their spirits, their group of spirits of scientists were creating different worlds, and some of them probably much older than Earth itself, which would suggest that it would not be unexpected to see civilizations there evolving at much higher levels than where we are with Earth, having societies, spirits that are more involved. So what does this mean to us? How does this happen? Well, the spirits are all the same. So regardless of where we are in the universe, God created all the spirits to be the same. And when they go through reincarnation, so once they cease their lifespan, whatever it is in their planets, they die, they go to the spiritual world. And the spiritual world is not necessarily limited by the same distances and times that we are in this universe, which creates the possibility that we, as spirits, will or have reincarnated in different planets. And this is part of how we see in the Spirit's book that this takes place, is that as we evolve, the planet evolves. Sometimes we evolve past the planet, which allows us the privilege, luxury, of possibly reincarnating in another world that is much more evolved. So we're now going to the next grade, you say, in school, and now we'll have a chance to continue our progression to perfection in that planet. But what happens in the other end? What if we have a group of spirits who, for whatever reason, have not or refuse to continue their evolution at the same pace that that planet is taking? What if we are flunking that school year? Well, what happens is that the spirits may make a bold decision that in order for the planet to continue its evolution, those spirits are not supposed, really can't come back and reincarnate again in that planet. So they're pushed to another planet, one that is of lower evolution, to where they are, right? And they become then kind of like a senior has been downgraded to be a junior. They become the big shots in this planet. Now, they're not physically being moved. It's not like their bodies, which in their planet could be completely incompatible with this planet. Their spirits are being moved and reborn. And as you're reborn here on Earth in a different body, they may not necessarily be accustomed to, but still they're reborn, they adapt, they forget. Obviously, we forget our past lives, but we don't forget everything. There are some levels of knowledge or insights, intuitions that we see in terms of what we eventually call the geniuses or so forth, that are retained in that spirit. So if a spirit from a much more evolved planet dies, reincarnates here, that child, when they grows to older, they will have ideas. They will be able to bring in some knowledge that could be hundreds of years more advanced than the family that they got reborn into. And they could start influencing. If there's enough number of these different groups coming in, then that could make a difference. It could create a peak of knowledge that would not have evolved naturally in the same period of time. So it creates a discontinuity in the knowledge, and thus explains some of these oddities, these wonders that we can't really explain otherwise. So in this book, it tells us that Earth was beneficiary of groups of spirits coming from a constellation called Capella, right? Kind kind of a solar system called Capella. When there were quite a few number of spirits, the planets were evolving. They were not. And then they were kind of downgraded to Earth. And they created, they mixed, obviously not mixed, but they were born into the groups, the population that existed here already, that were going through a much slower process of evolution, going through the learnings the hard way. And suddenly the large enough number of these spirits reincarnate in a specific geographical area, and thus they make these leaps of technology. Remember that they were here kind of doing a second term, and eventually, as they help improve teaching things like irrigation, like astronomy, other times mathematics, once these spirits do their job and they understand why they need to evolve, these same spirits will no longer continue incarnating on Earth, and then maybe they'll go to Capella, or maybe they'll go to some other place, right? So they're here for a specific period of time. They change civilization, and this book talks about how it impacts especially certain areas in terms of Egypt, India, the Indo-Europeans, and the people of Israel, and how each one of them brings in specific knowledge that was unequal to what was there before. So in some ways, we start to see some similarities here. So what are the similarities? Well, Adam and Eve were expelled, right, from Eden. Well, these spirits were expelled from Capella. They felt kind of, betrayed or had this longing to the things they've lost. So great. So here we have a similar stories of a number or group of spirits who have been pushed out, and now they have to start over in this strange land. Sounds very familiar. Some of them were more scientific, others were more spiritual, others were more religious, right? So some of them go into what is to become Israel, right? And they bring in a lot of that knowledge in terms of monotheism, in terms of the covenant that they had experienced before. And maybe these are the stories that they tell of their past existence, their origin. But rather than being on Earth, these origins could be in a different planet. All very intriguing, all very subject to your own beliefs. But it still leaves us this certainty that as human beings, we're all always longing to understand our stories. These stories are what brings us together as a community, as a religious group, as an ethnic group. And these stories, whether they're necessarily true or if they are partially true or whatever, nevertheless, they create a common language among us, whether these are the moral teachings, the spiritual teachings, or any other common thoughts that unite us as human beings. These has been the real driver for the evolution of our civilization. And we will continue to explore, and we'll continue to challenge, or some will believe, some will make fun of these stories, but nevertheless, they are here. They are here for us to sometimes get some comfort out of them, maybe some curiosity, maybe some imaginations. Has been obviously source of many stories and books and fictions and so forth. But they are important. They are important to be told. And I hope everyone enjoyed the lecture today. If you have any questions, I still can receive them. Those who are on Facebook or YouTube, please share any questions, and we'll see if we can help with that. Very well. We will see you again next week when we have a new lecture, and I hope that you all have an excellent week, and may God bless you all, and hopefully you will have a little bit of time to think about some of the things that we discussed here this morning. Thank you very much for joining us, and God bless.